They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Good evening, everyone. We'd like to extend a really warm welcome for everyone attending this, our Rewild the Church webinar. My name's Hazel, I'm from Wildcard, and I'm going to be facilitating tonight for what I'm sure is going to be a really informative and inspiring evening. We're going to be hearing from some great speakers. Firstly, from Wildcard, we've got Imogen Macbeth, who's going to be delving into the detail of our campaign. And then Joel Scott-Halkes will be explaining the value of rewilding. Then we're going to be hearing from Naomi Oakley, a tenant farmer who's doing some really wonderful work in nature recovery. And after that, Clara Rushbrook will be making the theological case for rewilding. And last but by no means least, Chris Packham will be talking to us about why this campaign is so important and what our plans are. There's going to be opportunity for you to put your questions to the speakers. So if you write your questions into the Q&A box and one of our tech team will pick them up. But first of all, just to give you a little bit of background into who we are and what's happened in the lead up to this event, Wildcard are a grassroots organisation. We're made up of members who were really mourning the destruction of nature and the growing effects of climate change, but then found something that was really hopeful in rewilding or nature restoration or ecological rebalancing, or however you want to name it. We know that tackling making action which restores our environment, rather than just taking what we want from it, creates a relationship to the world which has real potential. The barrier for us in the UK, though, is that there's a lack of land democracy. 50% of our nation is owned by a tiny 1% of the population. So our mission at Wildcard is to get these large landowners to take their responsibility for the planet seriously and start using the power they have to make the changes we need to see for nature recovery. And our journey so far has been incredibly joyful. We've managed to galvanise the support of 250,000 people, really, who have taken action to support us. We started with the Rewild the Royals campaign, backed by leading scientists and celebrity supporters, calling for the Royals to rewild 50% of their land. We had a petition that was signed by over 100,000 people for that purpose. And the fantastic thing is that we have seen change brought about by these actions with the Royals. It led to the Crown Estate hooking up with rewilding experts, and there are now beavers on the Crown Estate land. It also led to Prince William committing to doubling the size of one of the rare temperate rainforests on Dotmore. And we have even seen the King beginning to restore the ecology of rivers on his private land at Balmoral. So we know that our campaigns can make a difference. And now we're calling on the church commissioners to play their part too. The Church of England is one of the biggest landowners. They own land 3 times the size of Birmingham, and we know that committing to the UN figure of restoring 30% of land to nature by 2030, they can help to address climate change, strengthen food security, and create more resilience to what the future holds. Imogen, who's one of our team, coming from a Christian background, knew that there was a really strong theological case to be made for rewilding. So we looked into this further. We were delighted to hook up with Christian Climate Action, and we organised a beautiful event in London at the start of October, which some of you may have been a part of. We may have read about it on our website or in the national press. We even made the front page of the Church Times. The centerpiece of this was this huge scroll, 95 theses, which made the case for the church to rewild. That was written by theologians and scientists and climate activists, politicians, celebrities, and members of the church community. Alongside this, we've got a petition running with 38 Degrees, which has already amassed 104,000 signatures, asking for the rewilding of the church's massive land holdings. So we're really optimistic that the Rewild the Church campaign has the backing needed to see success, but we need your help to take it to the next level. We'd like to see a motion passed at the Synod to secure a real commitment from the Church of England to make the changes that will help to save nature. So please stick around, because at the end of our speakers, we'll be sharing a link to a WhatsApp chat, and that will enable you to get involved. But first, to help us gain a bit of perspective and get our heads into the subject, it would be really great to hear briefly from each of our panelists about their key concerns or reflections on the state of nature in Britain, or maybe just a juicy fact. So if we go first to Imogen.
Well, thank you, Hazel. I'll keep mine short and sweet with a very quick fact that Britain is in the lowest 10% countries worldwide for biodiversity. And I think it's really easy when you're walking down the street to sort of think that this is the baseline or this is how it's always been. And yeah, I really want to challenge that narrative because it's not true. And that's a fact that sort of keeps me awake at night.
Thank you. Joel, how about you?
Yeah, I spend so much of my life kind of immersed in many of these facts. Numerically, I know how serious the situation is, but this summer is what really landed it for me. I've got a 18-month-old daughter. She loves butterflies. She calls them, she says "Bubba" when she sees them. And we planted butterfly-friendly bushes in our garden, and we barely saw any butterflies. And this was the least butterflied summer on record in Britain, which makes you realise we're living through the collapse right now, and that's what is worrying me the most.
Okay, thank you. Naomi.
I was reflecting on that, and I was thinking what was the most magical thing that I can remember from my childhood, and that was holding my dad's hand and being taken down to the river that runs through our farm. It's only a small river, probably only 5 foot wide, and there being these huge salmon in the water, like mysterious creatures that had come up the river, and they were waiting for the rains for the water level to rise so they could go and spawn. And that was just a magical thing. And I love children that come in generations in front of me on the land to have that same experience one day.
Okay, thank you. That same question to Clara.
Hi, I think I'm really aware that there's a lot less insects and bees. So we live in the city, and we used to have bumblebees that lived in our roof space. Or if they didn't live in the roof space, then they lived in the compost bin. Bit inconvenient at times when you want the compost, but they lived in the compost bin. Then I haven't seen the bees now for at least 3 or 4 years.
Thank you. And finally, Chris.
Well, there is such a multitude of oppressive things which we noticed either, subjectively, as we've heard, or as Joel intimated, we are bequeathed with an enormous raft of statistics relating to data that have been very accurately generated. So we know that we're in deep, deep trouble in the UK. I think the thing that, however, gives me, more sleeplessness than that is the fact that we have a collection of bodies who have purported to have been investing in, nature recovery, restoration, and conservation, and yet their efficacy is so low. What troubles me most is that as a movement, we are not exercising our strengths to their maximum capacity. We're not communicating, we're not strategizing, we're not sometimes seeing the bigger picture. So I tend to turn all of my angst, principally, I suppose, therefore, upon myself and the role that I play in that movement. And it's that generates the dissatisfaction. I think that that's we, not they, those that are not concerned or aren't aware of the plight of those butterflies and those bees and those salmon, but we have to just work, at this point harder than we are to be effective. And that's why I'm very pleased to be here tonight, because this is part and parcel of that need to communicate and essentially grow a more effective community. It's not about me, it's not about you, it's not about us, it's about everyone, and we've got to draw everyone in. And if there were more people involved in shaping that and driving that effectively, then I probably would nap more easily.
Thank you, Chris. Sounds like a really good point at which to start, and hopefully after tonight you can get a bit of more sleep. Okay, so we'll go to our first speaker now. Our first speaker is Imogen Macbeth. Imogen is a young Christian and the campaign lead on the Rewild the Church campaign. Alongside being an activist with Wildcard, Imogen is a community organiser in Hull, working on building local democracies and ecological economies. Over to you, Imogen.
Thanks, Hazel. I wanted to start today with more of a personal reason on why I'm working on this campaign. So I grew up in a church called Openshaw Baptist Tabernacle. Tabernacle meaning tent, meaning it's not the building that makes a place sacred, but the community and connection. As a teenager, we changed to a forest church, which meant every time we gathered, we would go to the mountains or forests or lakes, and we worshipped and read poetry and sang songs. And because I grew up in Manchester, we would go to the Peak District a lot. But I wouldn't call this wild. The carefully straight walls of sheep fields, the inch-long grass, and the architectured reservoirs. It was very different to life in city, but as a child, and especially as a child, I ached for the wild, for this abundance of life that happens when you stop trying to tame and control. I'm now an activist with Wildcard, campaigning for rewilding and community ownership of land. Alongside that, I'm a community organiser in Hull, specifically looking at local participatory democracies and how to resource communities so that we can make decisions. Because we don't have equal ownership and access to land and resources. We are incredibly unequal in this country in that respect. And land and resources are hoarded in the name of paternity, of acting on behalf of others rather than including them. So we should be asking, where are the wild spaces? But more importantly to me is, where could the wild spaces be? Who has that land and resources to make that happen? And this led me to look at the church. So Rewild the Church is a campaign asking the Church of England, specifically the Church Commissioners, to rewild 30% of their English land by 2030. The Church Commissioners are the investment body of the Church of England, meaning they manage the land, investments, and property, among other stuff, and have an investment portfolio of over £10 billion. The Church of England is one of the biggest landowners in the UK, owning 200,000 acres of land. And if you're a visual learner like me, that's 3 times the size of Birmingham. And the Church Commissioners own just over half of this, with 105,000 acres. Now, there are some slight discrepancies on how much land they exactly own, but because the church is exempt from Freedom of Information Acts and we don't have a complete map of their land, despite members of Parliament asking for it, we're sticking to the government statistic of 105,000 acres. Britain is more unequally owned than almost any other country. 50% of England is owned by less than 1% of the population. So big landowners have to bear the brunt of this responsibility to rewild. Now, I have an incredible amount of hope for this campaign because it's a campaign centered around the church, an institution that has done some amazing things already. And what I really don't want to do here is paint them as this bad or secretive institution, because we're not against that. We're not against the church. We want to work with them. And the church has done some amazingly bold things in recent years and has church communities across the country. Divesting, for example. After successful campaigning by Operation Noah and Christian Climate Action and Christians around the country, the Church of England has fully divested from the oil and gas industry. And this is way ahead of other institutions in the UK. They and church congregations recognised that there is an emergency, and acted upon it. And this is something that should be celebrated. The church already has some rewilding and nature restoration projects as well. They own 100 acres on the bankside of the River Wye. And so we know this campaign is possible because they're already doing it to some degree. Churches around the country have mobilised and done what they can for nature, leaving graveyards open for biodiversity to return, engaging Sunday schools by making bird boxes or running campaign groups. So we want to build off this incredible legacy And because they have land and resources, this could be another incredibly bold thing to do. But given all this amazing work, it's disappointing that land isn't given the same considerations as the climate. And so I want to do a bit of a deep dive into church land. So research by Guy Strubschel shows that the church commissioners only have 4% of their land. Only 4% of their land is covered by trees, compared to the UK average of 13%, making them by far the lowest in the top 10 English landowners. Now, of course, tree coverage isn't the only measurement of biodiversity, but it does tell us a lot. More than half of their sites of special scientific interest, which is the highest designation for nature protection in the UK, are in unfavourable condition, despite having the legal obligation to protect them. They also own 5,000 acres of fenland peat. And this naturally should be squelchy and wet and buzzing with life and captures centuries of carbon. And the commissioners are draining it and farming it, meaning that the peatland carbon is degrading and being emitted at a very fast rate. So rewilding is not just a biodiversity solution, but a climate one as well. And in this climate emergency, it's irresponsible to be farming on fenland peat. So that's a brief overview into church land. And rewilding 30% of this could create an area of land 90 times the size of Hyde Park, which is absolutely massive. And we're asking for 30% because 30 by 30 is a UN international target. So we have two COPs, one for climate and one for nature. And the church is listening to the climate COP and have made amazing steps and progress and are in line with the Paris Agreement. But by failing to meet the other COP, the biodiversity targets, you're essentially saying screw you to nature and screw you to future generations. So I'm going to share some images from our campaign so far. Just bear with me while I sort the tech out. So over the past few months, we've been meeting with Christians, land justice experts, ecologists, and church campaigners to build this picture of what we're asking for and how do we go about getting it. And we've had some really, really helpful and amazing advice along the way. We also started collecting our 95 wild theses. This huge open letter signed by church leaders, Christians, broadcasters, politicians, actors, policymakers, theologians, and so many more. Each person giving reasons why they should rewild. We soft launched our campaign in August, where we published our video and launched our petition, which is still ongoing and now has over 100,000 signatures. On the 6th of October, we hard launched, where we presented this 95 wild theses. And if you were there, you can testify that it was massive. It was like 2 meters by 10 meters, very heavy to carry. It was really great. And Christians, nature lovers, artists, and more gathered outside St. Paul's Cathedral, and we listened to speeches by Guy Strubschel, Clara Rushbrook, Chris Packham, Reverend Hilary Brond, and Paul Powsland. We sang together and we marched, and it was a really beautiful day. So that was a month ago. And since then, as well as having a much needed rest, we've been focusing on speaking and spending time building relationship with synod members. Because ultimately, we need to take this to the General Synod, which is the democratic body of the church. Hazel's going to talk at the end a bit more about the concrete steps, but we want to engage both people outside the synod to mobilize our local church communities and bring this joyous message there, and also synod members on how we can get this passed. Since then, we've also been doing some more grassroots work, getting back to our roots. This is a picture of a different 95 wild thesis I did at Martin Luther King House, where we engaged lots of students and ministers in training who are then going to take this back to their own churches, coming up with our own reasons to rewild. We started this campaign with a lot of joy and a lot of colour and humour and good spirits. And of course, a giant beaver. And this is exactly how we're going to keep going. I wanted to end my section today with a quote from the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams. He gave this as an entry to our 95 Wild Theses to put his name behind our campaign. Here's what he said. God saw that it was good. Do we? Letting the natural world be itself, not just a reserve bank for our convenience, is an act of grace, and one that we should be glad to embrace. Because when the world around us flourishes, so do we. The material life, in the midst of which we live, is the neighbour we must learn to love, and love for itself. Over to you, Hazel.
Thank you. And it's great to hear that the church are already doing some good things. We just need them to do a lot better, especially on biodiversity. Just because it's come up in the questions, to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available for you afterwards, because we've had several questions about that. So now we're going to turn to Joel Scott-Halkes. He's a Wildcard co-founder and currently works as a strategy and policy lead with us. In co-founding Wildcard, Joel and the team work closely with ecologists, rewilding experts and climate scientists to map out a realistic pathway to a nature-positive future. As a consultant on rewilding and food systems, Joel has worked for a range of international charities, media outlets and governments on issues including plastic pollution, agricultural subsidies, land sparing and alternative proteins. Joel lives in Plymouth and he loves exploring Dartmoor. Over to you, Joel.
Thank you so much, Hazel. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm hoping you can all see a lion. There you go. Can everyone see that? Okay, that's great. Fantastic. Well, I'm incredible to follow after such a brilliant introduction, such brilliant speech from Imogen. So thank you so much. But what I want to start by saying is an incredible revelation that happened to me during lockdown. I, like many of us, knew the serious state that nature was in, but it was realizing just how far down the path we had got in Britain to total ecological collapse that drove me and a group of other people to start Wildcard and begin on this journey. And the thing is, everywhere you look in the British landscape, you can see ghosts. And one of those ghosts you can find actually right there in central London, near to where we did our big campaign launch at St. Paul's Cathedral. Because there, believe it or not, under the lions in Trafalgar Square, when they were excavating Trafalgar Square to build these back in the late Victorian period, an astonishing discovery was made. And that astonishing discovery was the tooth of a lion, an actual lion, a cave lion to be precise, one of the species that used to be here on the British Islands and went extinct somewhere around 12 to 14,000 years ago. And it's just one of the astonishing bits of ecological heritage that we have completely forgotten used to be here on these islands. It's not only lions that used to be here, there used to be straight-tusked elephants and hippos as well on the British Islands. Now, whilst the jury is out as to whether those incredible megafauna left these islands due to overkill or overchill from the Ice Age, one thing is certain, and it's that these animals were our fault. The brown bear would have been here at the time of the Norman conquest when William the Conqueror is arriving and went extinct shortly after 1,000 years ago. The wolf used to roam these islands and was here at the time of Shakespeare and only went extinct at the end of the 17th century. The elk would have been here sometime with our more prehistoric ancestors 2,000, 3,000 years ago. The crane in the centuries around the wolf as well. But it's not just the species that we've lost. We have also lost entire habitats. Temperate rainforests used to cover 20% of the British Islands. 20%, astonishing. Now far less than 1% remains. Our wildflower meadows, we've lost 97% of them. Our river ecology, we know the state of our rivers, I don't need to tell you. Our heathlands are grazed to a point of total degradation where the soils are washing off the hills, and our fenlands, as we're hearing, far from being squelchy and peaty and lovely, are drained and farmed where they shouldn't be. Now, there's a whole host of complex reasons that are brought here, but one of the single biggest issues behind the reason that we have de-wilded so successfully is the way that we use land in Britain. And quite simply, we use too much of it for producing food and not enough of it for doing other things. Now, in this country, we have one of the highest meat and dairy consumptions anywhere in the world. And Wildcard's not a vegan campaign, but we're saying, like most of the climate experts and most of the nature experts, that when you look at the map and you see that beef and lamb, grazing and dairy occupy such a large area, and indeed animal agriculture occupies 85% of all our farmland, well, it's clear that with some modest changes to diet, you can have food security and you can have a hell of a lot of space for that rewilding and for those habitats to come back. And well, if you look in here, it's quite difficult to find, gosh, where even is the nature in this? And indeed, if we listen to the best numbers available, such as those by the RSPB, it is less than around 3% of Britain that is adequately protected for nature. So what is rewilding? How is it a solution to all of this sort of thing? Well, rewilding is not this. Rewilding is the opposite of going in and trying to manually reconstruct nature by putting plastic tree guards in the ground or looking at one single species and saying, right, the success of this nature project will be if we can double the number of these birds or bring back 100 of these amphibians. Rewilding starts from a different principle. It starts from a systems perspective, and it starts from letting nature take the lead. Now, you don't have to call it rewilding, and as Naomi will probably allude to later, there's problems with that term, particularly in the fact that it can imply that this is not involving humans, but as we'll see, actually, it's integrally involving humans, a huge part of it. But what it does signal is that things like this can take place. Natural regeneration of forest. So this is a field, this is what happens when you just let it go rather than going in and manually trying to do it. Far less plastic tree guards, you can see, and what you end up with is incredible structural diversity, young trees, old trees, thickets, scrub, and all of the nature that comes in between it. You can see here in this image from the wonderful Trees for Life project in Scotland, the fence down the middle. All they did here was exclude deer who were overgrazing. So on the left, that's when you leave very high numbers of deer. On the right, just let it go. And that's what happens. You get this incredible ecosystem starting to naturally regenerate themselves. Now, these natural ecosystems that are restored in these ways are more resilient. They're more diverse in terms of more species diversity. And there's evidence to suggest that they might be more carbon rich as well than those ecosystems that we've started to kind of try to manually tape back together instead. But rewilding is not just about letting those systems come back. There's huge amounts of intervention that we need to do as well. And one of those things is reintroducing species, especially adorable but incredible genius species like the beaver. Now, the beaver is an example of what we call keystone species. Keystone evoking one of those old bridges. We've got a single one in the middle. If you remove that species, the whole ecosystem collapses around it. And to really imagine that, what you need to do is just put it back and see what happens. And if you put beavers back into a landscape that's even got a tiny trickle of water, you don't even need a big river, just a little trickle, it will create an incredible, wiggly, wet landscape of its ponds behind those beaver dams. Now, I wish we had longer to go into the details of this because I love beavers and I love visiting beaver landscapes. But I can tell you when you go to a beaver landscape, you know you're there. It is totally different from the rest of the British countryside with these straight rivers down their straight banks. Beavers block in many places, and what they do is create habitats for loads of other species. So just in this image, you can see that the ponds they create are incredible for fish and amphibians. The new messy banks they create are amazing for water voles, which love to move in. They gnaw down the trees and open up spaces where now the bats can go through and have feeding corridors. And with these new thickets of scrub where the trees try to regrow, oh my God, suddenly you get these birds and you get more insects that are hatching out of the water so the birds can eat it. And humans downstream can benefit as well. These dams break the floodwaters that can be so damaging, and they can even filter and clean the water. So the water downstream is cleaner of pollutants as well. Here's one in action. And here's a beaver landscape from the air. And amazing, there's even evidence that suggests that during heat waves, these wet beaver landscapes can cool the atmosphere above it. So cool. Now, it's not just beavers, though. There's a whole host of other species that we can reintroduce to the landscape. And one of those really points towards the way in which farming and rewilding, or nature restoration, if we want to call it, are so integral, and why farmers are now many of the leaders of the rewilding revolution. Because one thing that we've got as a mistaken notion about the British landscape is we've got this idea that if you did just go back to a more natural landscape, it would just be trees, you know, all the way, Land's End, John O'Groats, just trees the whole way. But that's not how it was. The ecological, archaeological evidence tells us that we would have had a mosaic landscape in which big herbivores, particularly ancient aurochs and also things like deer, ponies, and smaller ruffling herbivores, omnivores like pigs, would have broken up that landscape. And they'd have done so by creating an area in which some is very grazed, and you get those sort of wildflowery areas where a herbivore like a large auroch is grazing a lot. Areas where they graze a little bit less would go to scrub and create these huge, thick, scrubby areas. You can see those in the sort of the bottom left of the image here. And then areas where the trees get the upper hand do turn into woods. But those woods are messy and they're broken up. It's a patchwork, it's a mosaic. And so you get this incredible mixture of different habitats all within one landscape. Now, this image is taken from one of the most famous rewilding projects in Britain. It's the Knepp estate. And the Knepp estate sells some of its meat. And that's because without wolves, without big carnivores, which realistically in the short term are not going to be roving around lowland Britain, these animals, these being long-horned cattle brought in here as a proxy for ancient aurochs, still need managing and still need culling as well. And so those skills that farmers have, as you can see here, directly translatable to managing those rewilding projects. And these comes with so many successes. The nightingale is a beautiful example of one that's taken off at Knepp, as is the purple emperor butterfly, amazing, charismatic butterfly. And both these species rely on that scrubby, thick stuff that happens in those mosaic landscapes. Now, nature needs space all to itself sometimes, or at least it needs space in which nature is the primary output. It's very important that we make sure that most of our farming is becoming as regenerative as possible, as organic as possible. It's using less agri-chemicals. But as well as that, as recognized by the United Nations, you've got to have areas in which we say, this area, it's nature first, and if some food comes from it, fantastic. And that's why at the famous Kunming-Montreal Protocol meeting, the COP that we were talking about, the United Nations, the one we forget about, the one for biodiversity, it's not for climate, an agreement was made to reach 30% of land and seas protected for nature, when nature comes first. That's what we're asking the Church Commissioners to do. Now, before I finish, I want to address one of the big arguments that we've been told. Well, we obviously heard already that food security and rewilding, totally compatible. It's clear that with even a modest bit of diet change, if we all ate a little bit less meat, there'd be plenty of space to reach the 30 by 30 goal in Britain. But one of the arguments that the Church Commissioners has floated in why they might be exempt from having to do this is that they only own high-grade farmland. And when you hear that, you go, oh, blimey, gosh. Well, if it's only high-grade farmland, we should probably give them a free pass. Keep going, guys. Keep you know, just don't worry about nature on your land. Now, in Britain, this gets technical for him, but it's fascinating because you'll see it's not fully true. There's 5 grades of farmland. This is how it's classified. And there's huge complexity in this that obviously we're only going into very top level here. But there's grades 1 to 5. And it's generally considered that grades 4 and 5, that's the very low productivity lands. So that's our uplands. And so in terms of food security, that's pretty easy going in terms of making a contribution towards the 30 by 30 target. You don't want to put all of it into nature restoration because some of those are incredible cultural landscapes where, say, upland farming is taking place, but it's less pressure. At the other end of the scale, grades 1 to 2, absolutely, it's really fair. Let's not touch it when it comes to nature restoration if we can avoid it. That really is super high productivity. If you want to produce lots of food on a small land area, grades 1 and 2 are important. But in between, there's grade 3. And grade 3 is, well, it's, as it suggests, it's somewhere in between those things. And as far as the government's concerned, parts of grade 3 land are good for other uses other than just growing food within a healthy, resilient economy, such as nature restoration. This is a government-backed scheme. This is the Boothby Rewilding project. At the moment, you can see the rewilding has not begun, but this is grade 3 farmland that's going into rewilding, backed by government subsidies. And similarly, grade 3, certain areas of grade 3 are being used for solar farms as well. And so we'll finish by asking the Church Commissioners, is it true that all of your land is high grade, i.e. grades 1 to 2? Well, thankfully, a member of parliament asked them a few years ago, and they are very obliging to reply to members of parliament questions. Kerry McCarthy MP wrote to church commissioners to clarify the claim that all of the Church of England church commissioners' land is high grade. And they answered tellingly, no, it's not. So 39% of church commissioner land, according to this letter, is grades 1 and 2. And we 100% agree with the church commissioners. For the sake of food security, producing lots of food and sparing land elsewhere for nature, don't touch it. That's got to be there. But thankfully, and this is the secret at the heart of the campaign, this is the thing that makes us so hopeful that the church commissioners, they know they can do this, and they know they can do it at scale. More than half of the church commissioners' land is in fact that mid-grade, grade 3, which, according to the government, according to rewilding experts, is in the right circumstance available for moving into nature. And you can see here, to strike that balance, and obviously as we're learning from nature, it's all about that balance, it would be entirely possible to meet 30 by 30 for nature on the church commissioner land while still having lots of land left for food production. And so the church commissioners could become world leaders in that crucial balance that we're going to have to strike in this perilous century, producing food, having livelihoods, having farmers be the leaders, whilst also being world leaders in those United Nations goals for nature. So I'm going to hand back to Hazel, but I'm going to leave my screen on because I've got a slide for Naomi, our next speaker.
Thanks, Joel. Thanks for building that picture of how things could look and how things do look at the moment. Our next speaker is Naomi Oakley. She works for Natural England, working on peatland and upland issues. She's currently leading on Waterlands, a Horizon 2020 project looking at wetlands for carbon storage, people and wildlife across Europe. She and her husband are tenants on an organic regenerative farm high on Dartmoor, where their focus is firmly in the nature first space. She's also a founder member of Central Dartmoor Farm Cluster Group. The group, alongside the Duchy of Cornwall, have secured a large landscape recovery bid for 30 home farms and their commons. She's also undertaking a PhD at Newcastle University on the social opportunities and barriers for regenerative land management on upland peatlands. So very qualified to speak to us. Thank you, Naomi.
Thank you for the opportunity. I come to you from a charming Premier Inn in Putney. I'm not at home at the moment, and that's part of my Natural England work. And the reason that I work for Natural England is, one, that I can have a wider reach, but secondly, because our upland farm is super marginal. It doesn't make enough money to for me to have the things that I want, like a pension and holidays and things like that. These farms are very marginal, always, and so they can't be pushed by having huge amounts of stock without ecological degradation. So I work so the farm doesn't have to work super hard. Our farm is a mile square. It ranges from some heather moorland, which is enclosed, really high quality. It's an overwintering site for merlin. We get ring ouzel passing through, and we've got resident cuckoo that are often ringed when they can be found. And we know that those cuckoos are coming back year on year from surveys done by the BTO. And we've also got this incredible wetlands on the farm. So they're valley mires, which are groundwater fed, and they're full of a rough tussocky grassland, and they have the marsh fritillary butterfly. Google it. It's the most beautiful butterfly. It's like a flying stained glass window. It's absolutely glorious. But they need to have the cattle grazing, and it's cattle grazing and pony nibbling that creates exactly the right conditions for this red data book insect. And alongside the marsh fritillary butterfly, we've got this bog hoverfly who looks like a big shiny bumblebee with clear wings with a black lacy edge. Most beautiful creatures. And all of this land is open to the public all the time. People can come whenever they like and enjoy nature. It's free. So as has already been said, we're organic. We were the first certified regenerative farm in this country. So that's been done properly, looking at every bit of inputs that we buy into the farm. It's been benchmarked against other farms, and we can see that a very low intensity of grazing with cattle and sheep. So we've got some fantastic archaeology, and the grass on that needs to be kept quite tight so that people can see the archaeology. And so in those areas, because you've got that carbon stored for centuries, because the archaeology is all intact, there's wonderful communities of wax caps, and people love to come along and look at the wax caps, and sometimes you get a few magic mushroomers, and so what? Everybody can come and enjoy it and see the beauty of a wider landscape within the Dartmoor National Park, but also the tiny things, the beauty of lichen and of the sunshine on a leaf, but all for free. And that's what I really love, is how we've been able, through regenerative farming, to build a sense of community that means that our farm is more important for a lot of people. You know, there are so few places that you can go where you're truly welcome and it's completely free. You can let your kids run wild, do what they fancy. And I think that it's because I'm passionate about ecology. My husband is passionate about public access, and he loves seeing people come to the farm. And I think what is really important is that it's taxpayers' money that supports upland farming. You know, it's people paying their tax, and then that goes into agri-environment to support us. That's why we're there. And so surely it's only right and fair and just that people can come and enjoy it. We do sell some meat and sheepskins and wool to people who want to buy it. And that's great, but we don't sell a huge amount. We add value, and most of the meat that we sell to people who visit the farm, who understand what we're doing, and they're interested in the way that we're farming. And we've also gathered together with half a dozen other duchy tenants, and now we have come together in a cluster. So we never got paid to come together. We came together around our passion for the marsh fritillary butterfly. And we used to have an independent person who would come and count the butterflies every year from Butterfly Conservation. Amazing organisation. And we had a little cup that we bought in a charity shop. And then she would tell us, you know, we'd all get together and she'd tell us who had won the most butterflies that year. And it was a crazy competition. You know, we were really interested in that. And nature brought us together as a community. And then other people began to be interested, and then we had Brexit, and then we had ELMS is coming, the new agri-environment scheme for farmers, and there's an opportunity for landscape scale recovery. And our landscape scale recovery project is 70 odd square miles, so that's people's home farms and people's commons, so the rights that people have on those as well. And we're looking at an individual level at our home farms, but then looking at a wider system level at where we can put nature, where we have to have our food production, because we've only got a little amount of that grade 3 land. We don't even have any 1 and 2 grade. But for our lower grades of land, we might have a little grazing, but we can definitely all look at what we can do together. And the duchy have been remarkable about it, to be honest. A lot of farmers are very conventional, and they are just into food production, but they're beginning to see that those natural capital assets around biodiversity and water and carbon, that's the way forward. And so they're beginning to look at their farms and at the commons as well, and thinking at a system level about how they can change their businesses to then begin to think about areas where they can pull back on production, maybe having fewer, hardier, better quality animals. And so all of those things mean that, and they're looking at the businesses as well. So what individual bits of your business makes money and what loses money, and then So you're looking at the quality of your stock and the quality of the habitats and the quality of the water. And that's a very different way for people to think about their businesses. And nature and climate is at the heart of all of that decision making. And I've been thinking about what would the church need to do to make that happen for their own tenants, because the church and the duchy have very many similarities. A lot of the land isn't in hand; they're managed by tenants that rent that land. And I was thinking that the things that made a difference to us was a really good land agent. So that's the person who acts between the farmer and the church, as a sort of as the agent dealing with the day-to-day running of that land. You need somebody who understands business and ecology and climate issues. You also need a framework for people, like a natural capital plan for each bit of land that you've got, that shows you as a farmer what are the important things on that land. You know, what are the natural assets that you should be looking after? It could be your peat, it could be your trees, it could be opportunities for things you could do. And I think the thing that's most important is not thinking about food production and nature as being separate things, about thinking as in a systematic way where those things can be combined. And nature isn't other. You know, we're not other to nature. We're part of that system. We must see ourselves as more aligned with nature. And that's how we should look at land as well, I think, and how the church would be better off to think. We need to show that kindness to land and to everything that lives within systems. So I think you need that natural capital plans, you need good land agents, you need a good framework, and you need a vision of what you're going to do. And that's linked to good monitoring and evaluation. And then the church can show the good they're doing. And I think that's something that could be really good socially, economically, and ecologically. And I would welcome that. And I think that would be an amazing thing for the church to do. And thank you for the opportunity of speaking today.
Thank you. That's really inspiring, seeing how things can work in practice on farmlands, and as a tenant farmer as well. Thank you so much. So we're going now to listen to Reverend Dr. Clara Rushbrook. Clara is the co-principal of the Northern Baptist College, co-director of the Network for Theology and Justice, and a Baptist minister. Her PhD is in eco-feminist theology, and she teaches on contemporary and contextual theologies and has a particular interest in intersectionality and embodied theologies such as feminist, womanist, eco, queer, and theology of the land. Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to be with you this evening. My interest in eco-theology goes back to the early 1990s, when I read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, written in 1962. And in that book, she describes how pesticide use is killing the insects, which in turn is killing the songbirds, and which in turn, she predicts, will kill the human child. I then came across an article by Robert Warrior called Of Canaanites, Cowboys and Indians, looking at understandings of land and beginning to ask questions about the theology of land and who owns land. What I'm going to focus on mostly this evening is looking at the resources that we have got within the church, looking at scripture, looking at the Bible. We have really well-known accounts of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, and again in Proverbs 8 and in the book of Job, marveling at the wonder and the goodness of creation. God created it and it was good. It was very good. We have psalms that speak of the earth declaring the glory of God, of the trees and the fields clapping their hands, of God's care and concern for all of creation. But some of these texts have also been interpreted in a way that has enabled us to justify our exploitation of creation and the planet. Specifically, the phrase that has been used in this way is the idea of God telling humanity in the Genesis narratives to have dominion over or to subdue the land, the plants, and the animals. Sometimes it's been translated as to have stewardship over. It's a slightly softer translation, but it still leads to us having a paternalistic relationship where we are the ones with power over the rest of creation. Also, it's often been interpreted that humanity as created last in the Genesis 1 accounts somehow means that we are created at the pinnacle of creation. We have thought of ourselves only as the imago Dei, or made in the image of God, and forgotten that we are also imago mundi, made in the image of the world. But others have interpreted and translated the Genesis text differently and in a non-hierarchical way to suggest that we are all part of God's created order, utterly dependent upon it, and that our role is more that of a caretaker or a gardener. Part of the problem is that Christianity was born into a very dualistic and hierarchical worldview, where spirit is seen above nature, soul is seen as more important than matter, and where the physical realm was often seen as evil. But this is not what the biblical narratives tell us. Here they say creation is good. It is very good. Much of my PhD research was on learning from indigenous cultures and spiritualities, which have a very different understanding of our relationship with land. In these worldviews, land is not a commodity which we own. Rather, we belong to the land. The land is literally understood to be the bones of our ancestors, whilst also being held in trust for 7 generations to come. Land is sacred, an expression of the or embodiment of the divine, which I'd suggest is much closer to the understanding that we have in the Genesis narratives. What does it mean, as George Tinker, an Indigenous American theologian, asks, to see the 4-leggeds and the 2-leggeds as our brothers and sisters, as our siblings, as an extension of our family? What does it mean to honour the earth and to take only what is needed for our survival, instead of exploiting it for profit? What does it mean to live in harmony with the earth, with God's creation? Ecofeminist theologian Sally McFague uses a fantastic metaphor of the world as the body of God. If we see the earth as sacred and as God's body, how does that shift our understanding and the ethics of how we relate to the natural world around us? Jesus meets Mary after the resurrection in a garden. In fact, she doesn't recognize him because she thinks he's the gardener. We talk about the tree of life and of Jesus being hung from a tree. And here we have him again, walking in the garden in the post-resurrection narratives. Jesus, throughout his ministry, uses images from the natural world in order to teach his disciples and us. The kingdom of God is like a mustard seed, a pearl, yeast kneaded through dough. The lilies of the field neither labour nor spin. Not even Solomon in all his glory is dressed like one of these. Jesus likens himself to the shepherd, the vine. Jesus says, when you care for the least of these among us, you care for him. So where does rewilding fit into the Bible and to our faith? I would say that this is a thread that runs all the way through from the Genesis narratives on into the New Testament and beyond. In our church liturgy, we give thanks for the gifts of bread and wine, the gifts of the earth, each time we celebrate communion. We use water in our baptismal ceremonies. And in our funerals, we return to the earth, dust to dust, ashes to ashes. We celebrate the Word made flesh each Christmas in the incarnation of Jesus. We watch nativity plays where the baby is placed in an animal's feeding trough. We celebrate new life in Christ along with the renewal of the earth each Easter, marking this by sharing Easter eggs and hot cross buns. We mark Gregation Sundays, praying for the crops, and we celebrate the bounty of the earth in our harvest festivals. Pentecost is the festival of fire and of the Holy Spirit. We are enlivened with the breath of God, which flows through the whole of creation. Imogen mentioned earlier that they and I led worship at Luther King Centre where I work just after we had the rewilding action at St. Paul's Cathedral. We shared a godly play of the creation story, and then we looked at how that earth had gradually become more and more polluted and how it was no longer good. And we invited our staff and our students to write yet more theses to add to the 95 wild theses we already had. So I just want to end by sharing a couple of these. God is every living thing that has been, that is now, and that is yet to be, and therefore nurturing and sustaining the earth is doing the same for God. Remember, O mortal, that you are dust, the same dust as the stars that spangle the night skies. Remember, O mortals, that you are carbon-based life forms, and that carbon is both a blessing and a curse in your hands. Remember, O mortals, that God declared all creation to be good, stardust and all dust. We have managed to destroy the earth that is deeply connected to us. As we spend time in worship, we have a guttural response that this is not right. We need to change not tomorrow, but now. May we recover a wild and anarchic approach to land and its uses, giving up our domination of it and risking a greener and bluer dynamic, the flow of the sea, the death and rebirth of the seed. And lastly, Anglican theologian Andrew Shanks reminds us that the systems that hold up our environmentally negative behaviour in place are so ingrained that hypocrisy is inevitable and any actions we take, but the choice is to sit back and do nothing or to get our hands dirty. The Church of England has the choice to do something real and tangible. We must act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clara. It's so important in a Rewilding the Church campaign to have that theological perspective and to be reminded of the sanctity of the natural world and our place within it. Thank you so much. And so next up, Chris Packham needs very little introduction. Some of us have been watching him since his Really Wild show days, where his passion for nature was infectious. He's been presenting shows on all things wild and wonderful ever since, including on the extremely popular Spring Watch, and he's used his status to be a powerful advocate and voice and campaigner for nature. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you this evening. I always like to start off by taking it back to basics, and that's, why are we here? Why are we on this webinar? Well, we're on this webinar because we're in deep, deep trouble. We're in deep trouble on a number of levels. Clearly, in terms of climate breakdown, we've seen the events unfolding around other parts of the world, weather events of extreme severity, which have taken people's lives and taken their livelihoods. Those are increasingly frequent, and they are undoubtedly, the scientists tell us, being exacerbated by the impact that we're having on our climate. We tend to consider climate and biodiversity loss as separate entities. We have separate COPs. I think this is entirely counterproductive. We know, of course, that these things are intrinsically intertwined. The other reason that we're here tonight is that we're not living in the world that we want to live in, that we know that we can live in. And that is that utopian world that some of us remember as children. It was interesting that in our introductions, people drew upon their experiences in their early parts of their life, which were perceived as that as being extremely rich. I would just like to remind them that if it was rich for you, imagine what it was like for your parents, your grandparents, and your great-grandparents. We must remember that our human lifespan is not really a very good biological barometer of the state of nature. Nevertheless, that is a natural thing that we do. So I'm not being critical of it. I'm equally as guilty of that as well. It's something that we're drawn to reminisce upon our own experiences and therefore create that disparity between rich and poor in terms of the world that we see. The reason that our world is so poor is not that we don't care. There are an enormous number of people who care, many of course on this call. It's simply that the methodology that we put in place has not worked. And one of the principal reasons that it's not worked is that it hasn't been, put into practice broadly enough and now rapidly enough. So a perfect case in point would be Naomi's farm. I mean, I hear about this, and I feel like I must jump on the train and go and see it. The marsh fritillaries, the hover flies. I mean, this sounds like a place that I want to be, where life can flourish, and indeed, I'm sure it is. Our problem is that these areas are focused. Now, when we every few years produce something called the State of Nature Report, I'm sure some of you at least are aware of this. So this is an amalgam of all of the data which we have for our monitored species in the UK, and we're good at monitoring. We've got an extremely able, cohort of people who go into the field, as it were, and they count butterflies, they count birds, they count bees, they count just a plethora of different indicator species. And we have that data set going back a long time, because culturally it's an interest that we've had for a long time. So our finger is very much on the pulse of the state of our distributions and populations of wild species in the UK. So what I'm trying to tell you is the State of the Nature Report, is published without ambiguity. It's a statement of truth and fact. Now, we've had a number of these reports, and the situation becomes increasingly dire as we read through them, i.e. the decline continues. And this indicates to me that, for all of our endeavors, for all of the skills that we've developed, all of the technologies that we've invented, all of the abilities and energies that we've employed, we are still losing. So, on the one hand, we are capable. You've got that farm with its marsh fritillaries. You've seen the photographs of Knepp, where we have flourishing populations of nightingales, which are declining elsewhere, where I have to tell you that at the outset of that project, there were no purple emperors, and now we have the largest population anywhere in the UK. So that is from 0 to 60 in terms of what that project has been able to enable. For all of those technologies, we are still losing. And one of the principal reasons that we are losing is inequality. And this is a historical, socio-economic, cultural thing. And again, it goes back to the very outset of this webinar, where someone said that basically 50% of the land is owned by 1% of the people. And as a consequence of that, all of those skills, all of those technologies, all of our practices, we simply haven't been able, not through lack of want, but haven't been able to roll those out more broadly, because frankly, folks, we haven't been able to afford it. So what we have done is, traditionally, we've had a system whereby we've acquired land at enormous cost. We put a fence around it. We've done everything we can to nurture it, and we've called it a nature reserve. And these nature reserves were like little pockets of the past, beautifully, pampered pockets of the past spread over our landscape. But since we started to employ that technique, the rest of that landscape has pretty much gone to hell in a handcart. And that's because we haven't been able to impact it there. So what we've recognized are two significant things. The nature reserve model leaves us with a great legacy. Each of those reserves, if properly managed, each of those SSSIs, if properly managed, and not enough are, is a repository of biodiversity. If you like, those are our seeds that we will plant in our future garden. Those are those residual populations of plants, animals, and fungi, which we hope will spread into our recovering landscape. Without them, we would be completely lost. So we are grateful for those endeavours of the people that have tried to instigate that as a method of effective conservation. But look, hands on heart, I'm one of those people. It's on my watch that I read of so many of those declines. I would consider myself, or I should have been, an effective, proactive conservationist since about 1983, when I graduated from university. But there's no ambiguity about the fact that during the course of that time, we've been sliding all too rapidly backwards. So what we've now recognized is that that we need access to more land. You saw Joel's map. which is pretty scary. And you heard the figure, 3% of the UK's land surface is in, space where we have nature. And we might make a clear argument that some of that 3% is not in good condition. We know that our sites of special scientific interest, because we've slashed the budget of Natural England over the last X years, we haven't given them the capacity to nurture those as we might have hoped and should have done. So we need access to land. So what Wildcard have been doing is looking at those people who have a public duty, but also own a lot of land. So we've gone to the Crown Estates, we've gone to essentially the royals, and now we've come to the church, because the church does own a lot of land. And as Joel has pointed out, a lot of that land is in both poor condition, 4% tree cover, that's terrible, but also it's land which ought to be available for environmental solutions. So that might be solar farms, it might be wind farms, it might be rewilding. And that brings us to rewilding, because rewilding is I won't say it's new. I think rewilding and the sorts of things that you've heard about, on the farm there have probably been happening for a long time. But the term and the broader practice is something that we've probably only seen in the last sort of 25 to 30 years. And it's added to our portfolio of approaches when it comes to nature restoration. And I think the reason why it's added in such an attractive way is that normally when we talk about rewilding, we talk about it at scale. So I might say I've rewilded my garden, but I think that might be an exaggeration. I might be better off saying that I'd been, gardening with wildlife in mind, strictly in mind. But rewilding is something that we know that works at scale. And also, as Joel has pointed out, it's not simply a matter of throwing a fence around it, although we saw on that photograph with the excluding the deer, that's just the start. That's okay, that's a good start. We wouldn't criticize someone for getting it going, but it is something that requires human intervention. And the people in place to intervene, the people with the machinery, the knowledge, and the need to invest are farmers. There are farmers. The problem that we have is that the human species is adaptable and resourceful and creative and imaginative and so many things. We are a remarkable organism, but we're not very good at change. We're very resistant to change. And we've seen this in contemporary politics. People don't like to have to change. And I think that one of the reasons, particularly within the environmental movement, and we might say plant-based eating might be a case in part, is that people don't like being told, they like being asked. And also people don't like being presented with problems that they find that difficult. They like being presented with opportunities. So the Wildcard approach is very much framed in that regard. In this instance, we are going to the church commissioners and we are saying, here is an opportunity. Broadly, yes, we have a wider problem, but you have an opportunity, and that immediately engenders the ability to act in a positive way. There's not conflict there. It's something there for the taking, and it is there for the taking. So our role at this point is to ring the alarm bell, but also to provide the solution. And I think that's another thing where the environmental movement hasn't been particularly good at times. We've been very good at sounding the alarm and saying there's a crisis, but we haven't been very good at saying, okay, there's a crisis, but here's the solution. And I think those two things need to go on the table at the same time. But rewilding, when it comes to, church land, is that solution. It's been tried and tested at scale, and we've seen this largely through philanthropic gestures like the farm and like NEP. But now we need to do that to get up to 30%. And these figures that we speak of and these percentages aren't arbitrary. These are figures that have been put in place with, by scientists who have invested time and effort to recognize what we need going forward to stabilize our landscape, to make sure that it is resilient and it can support both us and all of those other species going forward. I think this is a remarkable opportunity for the church, and I think that from a campaigning point of view, that the church is a perfect point of pressure, because going back to my opening remarks, what is the church but a community built upon kindness and goodness? My mother was a keen churchgoer. I would support her in that regard, and that's what I always saw: a collective, a community of people at a local level in that instance who were about support and kindness and good. Our role as Wildcard here is to open the eyes and facilitate those acts of kindness, acts of patience and tolerance and kindness, which will allow the church commissioners to facilitate the transition of their land to something better than it is now. And we've just simply got to pave that way for them. Now, I'm very pleased to say that this isn't a fight. We're not in a fight here as we might be with the fossil fuel industry, who are interested in bad business as usual and continuing to kill the planet. Here we are in conversation with, and we know that within the body of the Church of England, within the Synod, we have significant supporters. And at this point, what we're asking them to do is to come together and present a motion so that they can start this process of change. So let's practice what we preach. Let's use that urgency. Let's facilitate the capacity for change by framing that around opportunities, not problems. And let's do that with kindness, tolerance, and patience. But let's do it rapidly, because as we've seen in the past few weeks, our species is in desperate need of recovery as rapidly as possible. So before we wrap up this evening, I'd just like to say, if in any capacity you can help us with this campaign, with this discussion, then please reach out and join in. We are not asking, for your money. We're asking for your ability and for your energy and for your passion. And frankly, folks, you can't put a price on passion. So I think that's probably what we're most keen to receive. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris. And on the subject of opportunity, I'm going to pass over to Joel, who's going to outline this opportunity for you all to get more involved. Over to you, Joel.
Really, really quickly, as it's time to go to Q&As, absolutely. I've just put I put it in the wrong bit of the chat. I will any moment put it in the right bit of the chat. Hopefully you can all see the message I've just sent, which has links to 2 WhatsApp groups. Now, the next steps, we've been speaking to a number of Synod members who are really excited about the idea of putting this motion forwards behind the 30 by 30 goal at the General Synod. If you are a Synod member on this call, firstly, thanks so much for being here. We're really, really honoured that you've given up so much time of your evening to be here. But we'd love to invite you to come to a meeting that we're going to be holding in the next few weeks with Synod members interested in working on this. We want to pull everyone together so we can discuss it in the round and work out what the best route to writing a motion, raising a motion, and what the time frame for that would be. That's the second WhatsApp link I've put in the chat there. So if you can join that, if you're thinking, I don't really want to be part of a long WhatsApp group, then perhaps just join for now so we can get you to that meeting so you can get in the right place, and then we'll set up other chains of communication later on. For now, we just need one place to get everyone together and we'll set that meeting up. If you're not a member of the General Synod, like myself, if you're a church congregation member, if you're not a churchgoer, if you're any other part of society, we are going to be organising activities over the coming months to build momentum behind the idea of that motion. That will include doing activities like organising our own 95 Wild thesis writing sessions in community groups and churches, and pinning those to church doors. It will involve organising talks in dioceses and in churches and in community spaces, and taking digital actions and writing to the church and such like as well. So if you want to be up to date on that, can you join the WhatsApp link at the top, please, which is the first one, Rewild the Church for All. And similarly that would be a place where if we'll also provide opportunities if WhatsApp groups aren't your thing in the long run to also keep in touch. But for now, if you don't mind landing in there, that's a place where we'll gather everyone together. So to say again, if you're a Synod member, click on that second link and we'll set up that meeting in a few weeks to discuss it. And if you're everyone else, then and would love to be involved in the campaign, but you're not part of the General Synod, please join the top WhatsApp link there and you'd be so welcome. And we do that on the basis that if you're wanting to join the campaign, I think if you've got questions, if you've got criticisms, if you want to give feedback, we're trying to have these as organizing spaces, but we do want to hear criticism and feedback. So I will also put our email address in and we make an effort to respond to every email if you'd like to tell us more negative feelings about the campaign. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Joel. We've got 10 minutes left and we're going to put some questions to the panelists now. Thanks for the questions that have come in, and we've had quite a few, so we're just trying to pick as many as we can. First question for Clara. How do we deal with the lack of interest of some incumbents looking after their inner city churchyard for nature conservation? How can we get people living in an inner city area to take more interest?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think there's often a misconception that if you live in the inner city, you don't care about nature. I was minister for 14 years in inner city Manchester, and we care deeply about nature, and things like clean-up projects, litter picks, planting wildflowers, gardening, all of these things were great ways of engaging with the community and the church community. One of the things I noticed really early on was that everywhere you looked around the city, there would be dandelions poking their way through the concrete. Nature was wanting to burst out, and we just needed to help it along a little bit. So I think churchyards in inner city spaces can be beautiful spaces. They can be wild spaces. You can see all sorts of different birds and insects there. And I think we should be opening those spaces up and welcoming people into them. A number of people have put into the chat about eco-church. Eco-church is a really good scheme if you want to get your church and your church elders more involved with environmental issues. I would say that's a really good place to start.
Okay, thank you. Question for Imogen now. How much of what the church own is churchyards and former churchyards and land associated with churches? And how much is these tenanted farms and open landscape?
Yeah, so I'll make this really quick. So the Church of England as a whole owns 200,000 acres, and 105,000 acres is church commissioners' land. So all the other land is like church buildings, graveyards, glebe land, land around churches. That's all the other bits. And then the church commissioners, the land is just for investment. And the vast majority of that is tenant farmland, which is why, we've spoken so much about tenant farming today, and there's lots more information about that on our website. I won't go anymore because we don't have a lot of time. But
thank you. Next question is for Naomi. I love this question. Where is the regenerative farm in Devon? What is it called? I would like to take my grandchildren to experience it.
Fantastic question. We're Challacombe Farm, so CHALLACOMBE. We're between Widdicombe and Postbridge. And drop into the farmhouse. Come and park at the farmhouse. Come and see us. Come and say hello to our dogs. We'd love to see you. It'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Thanks. So Joel, this question, I see the church commissioners along with other large landowners signed a pledge organised by the National Trust committing them to helping government to meet net zero ambitions and reverse environmental damage. The signatories agreed to work together to ensure the natural resources in their lands were used to maximum effect to tackle climate change. Participants wrote to them, the then Environment Secretary, citing ways in which they planned to tackle climate change. These included restoring land for wildlife. The pledge was inscribed as a pact, the head of the real estate. Have we written to them to ask how they're getting on with complying with the pact that they were very pleased to announce?
So there's three things to say about this. I mean, the first thing to say, so this indeed is 2021. The big landowners of Britain, of England, did come together, had a lovely meeting, and all signed a pact at the end. this shows some good motivations. It's not like, as Chris said, we're not dealing with the fossil fuel industry here, which doesn't, wouldn't be bothered to do this sort of thing. This is a group of people who care. And I genuinely think, especially from our experience talking and having meetings with the Crown Estate during our campaign there, that people go into these jobs because they care about the land. You don't go into being a land manager because you want to trash the place, do you? So that's why this is a positive campaign. We know that there's actually a possibility here. People do sign things like this. But the unfortunate thing about it, like so many other gestures and pacts and these proclamations that have been made by landowners over the last decades, is that as nature free falls and plummets, these targets are often unnumerical, unquantifiable, and even if they are, they're never met. And in this case, it was not, they didn't even have numbers against them. So I've just had to quickly back up to refresh myself. But what it has to say about nature is create or restore homes for wildlife that support nature's recovery and provide long-term biodiversity increases. Brilliant. How much? How big? What, 1 acre, 2 acres, 30%, 50%? By what date? Meaningless. And that's the problem. We, as the unlanded public, are expected to sit back and just hope that these good intentions translate themselves into something proportionate to the response. But we need proper democracy. We need these landowners to actually be held accountable, because if we don't own the land ourselves, they need to tell us what's their target, when are they going to meet it, and then they need to show us, which the church commissioners don't, give us a map of their land so we could turn up and see, is it thriving with nature like Naomi's farm is, or is it still being intensively degraded? And so with those targets come possibility. And that's why the 30 by 31 is measurable and achievable and the pathway to action.
Thanks, Joel. And this next question is a really interesting one, because Christians are very interested in social justice as well, of course. And so the question is, what will happen to the tenant farmers, principally their income, if their land is to become rewilded? I'm not sure who would be good to answer this. I don't know if Chris, you want to address this one?
Okay.
Naomi raised a hand, actually. Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll start. Naomi, as a tenant farmer, can certainly chip in. Look, this is, again, not new technology. Rewilding Europe is an organisation that's been working with tenant farmers all over Europe. And the key word is transition. And we need to nurture those people through that transition. We need to, if we're going to ask them to do something differently, then again, we've got to go to the table with solutions in terms of what they can achieve elsewhere. One study that was done looking at sheep farming in Wales showed that when sheep farmers diversified, could be anything, pony trekking, Airbnb, so on and so forth, their income increased by 20%. Now that's looking at sheep farming, which is a part of the UK farming system which is particularly impoverished. So increasing it by 20% may not have been too difficult, but it is about that. It's about generating and setting up opportunities to make sure that these farmers and their families are able to move through that transition. But it's been tried, it's been tested. Of course, it's scary, but what's scarier? Because there will be no farming on a dead planet. So we've got to make sure that, again, we help these people through that ability to change their minds and change their practices. But we know that it works. And if we can communicate that to them, then they should eventually accept and trust our methods and motives.
Thank you. Naomi, do you want to add to that?
I do. At NEP, which is held up as the shining example of good practice, it needs a lot of people. It employs more people than the farm that was there before. And I think that's fantastic, and it employs a different sort of people with a different set of skills. So you still need people with farming skills, but you can have other people with other skills as well. And that's actually really exciting. And that's how we'll get sustainable, dynamic communities in the countryside.
Thank you. There's another question that someone's asked. How many of us are in this meeting? There's a really exciting 344 people on this call today. And also we know that this is being recorded, and some people who can't make it tonight are going to watch this on catch up. So that's really cool. So I have one last question that I want to ask to all our panelists before we close this evening. What would the church committing to 30 by 30 mean to you personally? And we're going to start with Imogen.
That's such a huge question, and it would mean so much. I'm 22, and I wonder what state of our land, of nature, of the biodiversity will look like when I'm 25, 30, 50, 70. And that doesn't really fill me with a lot of hope. It fills me with a lot of dread. But if we had these really big landowners starting to commit this and then show it and do it, yeah, it would change a lot. And most importantly, it would give hope, which I think is something a lot of us are lacking.
Thank you. Joel, same question.
So one of the things that started on my journey to becoming a full-time environmental activist was I had a conversation with my grandfather in which he said to me, when I was your age, I used to drive through the countryside and there was so many insects in the air. You know, we used to have the windscreen wipers on. Then I just remember thinking, I have never seen that. I've never seen that much life in the air. And I would love to be able to have that conversation in reverse with my own grandkid and say, God, you know what? When I was your age, there was no life in the air. All of this magic you've got now, all of these butterflies and these bees and these beetles, that's because our generation rewilded. We did it, and we made that for you.
Thank you. And Naomi, what would it mean to you?
It would mean the world to me, but what would be really exciting is if farmers could be the heroes in this story. If they could be the ones that embrace nature and restoration and conservation and climate, and are the ones that make it happen, that would be enormous for me. And if the church could be part of that, yeah, that would be immense. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Clara.
For me, it would be honouring the sacredness of the earth. It would be able to look back and say, not just that God says it's good, but we would be able to say it is good, it is very good. And for me, the importance of that Indigenous idea of holding the earth in trust for 7 generations to come, that's what keeps me going.
Thank you. And Chris.
Leadership. That's what we need at this point. We need leadership. Too many of our high-profile public people are very poor leaders. They're leading us in the wrong direction. And what we're looking for is people who are brave enough to stand up and say, I'm going to do this at whatever cost to me, because I'm going to be bold, I'm going to be brave, and I'm going to do what's right. And I think, isn't that the church? Bold, brave, doing what's right? Isn't that what has driven that ethos for all of that time? So this is what we're crying out for. And here there's an enormous capacity for this body of people to say that they are bold and brave and they will take on this leadership. That would be fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to all our panelists this evening. And thanks also, you won't have noticed, Ed, who's been working on our tech behind the scenes. But the biggest thank you of all to all of you for being here today. And we're really looking forward to working with you all and to making this campaign together an opportunity for the church and for it being an absolute success for nature. Thank you so much and good night.